Now the first thing you want to do is disconnect the negative battery cable. Now that you have disconnected the negative battery cable, once you relieve the fuel pressure, and right back there you're going to see the two fuel lines. Disconnect them. They're two different sizes. First thing you want to do is remove the clip. And use the fuel line disconnect tool right here. You have to choose the right size for each one. And then just push it in and it will lift the spring. It will let the line separate. And then set the lines aside. Now that you have the fuel line disconnected, drain the radiator fluid. First thing, remove the radiator cap. And then on the radiator, on the right side of the engine compartment, down corner of the radiator, you're gonna see the drain plug. Use a 90mm or 3/4 wrench and remove it to drain the fluid. You can also get access to it through the right front wheel well. Make sure you use a drain pan to catch the radiator coolant. Next, remove the throttle body cover. You have three 10mm bolts. Now that you remove the throttle body cover, remove the air intake assembly. Disconnect here and use an 8mm or flathead screwdriver there. And then disconnect the air temperature sensor and the mass airflow sensor connector. Do not disconnect it from here. On the mass airflow sensor right by the brake master cylinder, you're gonna see the connector underneath. Just disconnect it right here. And also disconnect these two air vent tubes from the air intake assembly. Now that you remove the air intake assembly, disconnect the upper radiator hose at the thermostat housing. And then just move the hose out of the way. Now that you remove the upper radiator hose and set it aside, disconnect the throttle body cables. This cable, you want to push it backwards, disconnect it. And then the throttle cable, just want to disconnect it here. And a spring, just remove the spring. Then remove this bracket, these two 10mm bolts. Now that you remove the throttle cable bracket and set it out of the way, remove the vent tube, disconnect it from back here, set it aside, and then just pull it off, set it aside. Next, disconnect the connector to the exhaust pressure differential sensor and the EGR vacuum solenoid. And then remove the vacuum to the EGR valve. The solenoid, make sure when you pull in here, you don't bend or twist because you could break the solenoid where it connects. Just pull it straight. And then disconnect the vacuum to the manifold. And on the fuel pressure regulator. And then remove it off the purge solenoid. And then once you disconnect all those connections, set the vacuum line aside. Now remove these hoses to the exhaust pressure differential sensor. And then set it aside. Now that you remove the electrical connector and the vacuum line, remove this bracket with the sensors intact. There's a 10mm bolt here and there's a 10mm nut here. Remove this bracket to the power steering reservoir on the thermostat housing. There's three 8mm bolts. Now remove the EGR manifold tube. It's a 32 millimeter. Then disconnect the throttle position sensor. Now if you have spark plug wires in the way, remove them and set them aside. Next, remove the alternator belt and then remove the alternator. Now to remove the belt, you can use a 1/2 inch ratchet right here and just press down. And just leave the belt right there. Then remove the alternator. To remove the alternator, remove these 3 10mm bolts with a bracket. Remove the heater coil hose right here at the intake manifold. Now on the 2 lower alternator bolts, do not remove them. Just back them out and just leave them on there. It'll make it easy to reinstall the alternator. And it's designed to sit in place when you reinstall the alternator. So just leave them on and then remove the alternator and set it aside. Now we're going to remove the throttle body. You want to disconnect this hose from the throttle body and the brake booster hose to the throttle body. Remove that 10mm bolt and then disconnect it from there to the throttle body. And then if you can get to the idler air connector, take it off. If not, just leave it on. When we remove the throttle body, we'll be able to pull it forward and get to it behind. To remove the throttle body, you got these 4 8mm bolts. It's one here and one here. One here, behind over here. Now once you remove the 4 bolts, just pick it up, bring it forward, and now you can reach the connector. Disconnect it and set the throttle body aside. Disconnect the fuel injectors and disconnect the coil harness on all 8 of them and set the harness aside, and then remove the ignition coils. And the way to disconnect the fuel injector connector is press on these 2 tabs right here, push out. And on the ignition coil, right underneath, there's a tab. Just press it up. Tap right here. To remove the 8 coils, there's 7mm bolts holding it in. Just remove that bolt and the coil pulls right out. Now that you disconnected the fuel injectors and remove the ignition coils, next remove the intake manifold bolts. You have 11 10mm bolts. So you got 5 bolts here and then 5 bolts on this side, including this one, for a total 11. Now according to the manufacturer, they want you to remove the bolts in reverse order of the tightening sequence. Now once you remove all the manifold bolts, just grab the manifold and lift it out. Behind it you got the PCV valve tube. If the tube is okay, just leave it there and just remove it with the manifold. If it needs to be replaced, this is the time to replace it. And then remove the manifold off the vehicle.